Brothers and sisters, as my sainted mother used to say, isn't this a beautiful day that the Lord has given us? It just so happens that the premise that underlies that exclamation, that God is a cosmic orchestrator, a sort of behind-the-scenes wizard pulling myriad levers to keep everything running, is the very premise that underlies that part of the blessed old book of Job that I'm going to read to you today. A week ago I promised you a pleasant surprise, and now it's time to unveil it. In last Sunday's lesson, Zophar the cretinous Shuhite began a third speech, which was interrupted after only a handful of insults delivered in paired couplets by a thoroughly pissed-off Job, who vented his pent-up spleen for 6 long chapters, the last of which ended with a kind of emphatic double bar: "The words of Job are ended." That brought us to the conclusion of the second large part of this ancient biblical book, a round of speeches in response to Job's initial lament, ending at that termination point at the close of chapter 31. It seems likely to me that the first verse of chapter 32 also belongs to this narrative, and probably should have been included with it, much as the first 3 verses of Genesis 2 actually belong in chapter 1, the rest of chapter 2 being a completely different story. Those words are, "So these men ceased to answer Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes." Now I'm going to return to something I've mentioned before. The position held by a good many textual scholars that the remainder of chapter 32 and all of the text through chapter 37, 6 chapters in all, are a later scribal interpolation of large dimensions. It's actually a pretty interesting passage, and was, like the rest of this dreadful book, cherry-picked by my mentors in the ways of righteousness. But its presence does tremendous violence to the story. There's just no way it can be formally reconciled to the rest, as we will see when God begins speaking in chapter 38. And I'll take you there momentarily. But before I do, I just want to take a moment to snicker at that dire warning at the end of the Apocalypse, where the author, having adopted the voice of the creator of a trillion galaxies, warns, "For I testify unto every man that heareth the words of the prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life, and out of the holy city, and from the things which are written in this book." Even if you didn't grow up in a hellish backwater of religious rot like I did, you've probably intuited that the highest authorities of my childhood cult were convinced that the warning that we read there in Revelation pertains to the whole Bible, the Word of the living God in its entirety, sandwiched between leather covers. But right here is a long passage that's as obvious a later addition as anything I've ever encountered. Anyway, I'm going to skip it so that we can get to the juicy stuff, which begins with God strutting his many achievements. For reasons that will become obvious by the time I'm done with this, I'll get to the dinosaurs next week. This week's reading, however, includes plenty of other scientific details to wonder about. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. I believe I need to interrupt this narrative right now and draw your attention to something that I've mentioned before. The Bronze Age authors of the Bible believed that air is a spiritual force, and even the language they used betrays that misunderstanding. Here before us is an obvious example. Where else would one expect to find God except in a whirlwind? After all, he used one to suck the prophet Elijah up into heaven. I'll begin again. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. All right, this whole protracted boast is going to read just like that. The invisible, imaginary interlocutor, wise in all the ways of a universe he allegedly created, just rubbing it in old Job's face. Seriously, how can anyone read this stuff and imagine that it expresses a deity worthy of worship? The mind reels. But I suppose I should point out that the earth doesn't have foundations and no one laid anything. For a deity so arrogant, God sure is an ignorant immortal, ignorant apparently of the very mechanics of his own creation. Continuing, who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fashioned? Or who hath laid the cornerstone thereof? Sorry to keep interrupting the poetic flow. It's like stopping a piece of music every 4 measures to talk about what you just heard, and I know how aggravating that can be. But humor me if you can. The earth's foundations aren't fastened on anything because the earth doesn't have foundations or a cornerstone. It's kind of easy to understand, though, why the most zealous of Bible believers are also flat earthers, isn't it? I've met a few. I'm pretty sure there are a few in my own family. Going on. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. That's an interesting verse right there, and it's one that I cited many months ago when I was examining the early chapters of Genesis and chased down a reference to sons of God, which in that story seem to have been immortal beings who liked having sex with human women and whose loving attentions were responsible for the dreaded Nephilim, the giants of Genesis 6. King James Version. Here it's apparent that morning stars, the most notable being Venus, but a role that can also be played by Jupiter or Mars, are regarded as heavenly beings, angels. Psalm 104 has God making his angels spirits, his ministers a flame of fire. All this ties together into a really fascinating but utterly fictional cosmogony. Remember that this is the creator of everything who's asking these rhetorical questions. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? The sea is not shut up with doors, as millions of people living in topographically low-lying regions are finding out at a time of global warming and rising sea levels. Where are these doors when we need them? Isn't this a beautiful day that God has given us? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and brake up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. In no sense are the sea's proud waves stayed, neither with doors and bars or by any other means. Talk about an ignorant creator. I'm beginning to think the only thing this Mesopotamian clown ever created is the condition named after Dunning and Kruger. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the dayspring to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? It is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. And from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. Okay, if you've been indoctrinated in all that sciencey stuff they teach in the satanic public schools of this once Christian land, you might have trouble intuiting that the verses I just read are talking about a sunrise. Isn't this a beautiful day that the Lord has given us? This next verse is a wonder. It's been trotted out by every creationist apologist since the discovery half a century ago of hydrothermal vents at spreading seafloor centers miles beneath the ocean's surface, so-called black smokers. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Now, the hydrothermal vents, known as black smokers, are in no sense springs. I'd try to explain the mechanics of both springs and hydrothermal vents, but that would take a lot of doing, and I know you'd like to get on with your golf game. Have the gates of death been opened unto thee, or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. Thou know it all. Where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof, that thou shouldst take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldst know the paths to the house thereof? In those verses, God is asking if you know where the sun goes at night. This is an almost unbelievably primitive view of the world that's being revealed in these ancient verses. It's so hard for me to get my head around the fact that in an age of science, there are millions of people, hundreds of millions of them, who cling doggedly to these pathetic fictions, imagining them to be the wisest words ever written. Knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? This is a pretty common charge in the Bible, and one that I grew up hearing from my elders and betters. Shut up and listen, kid. Let an elder teach you. I seem to recall that some Pharisees got their knickers in a knot over Jesus' claim that he was before Abraham, when the Pharisees knew damned well that Jesus wasn't over 50 years old. Look that up. Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? The last couple of verses are so enigmatic, and I've heard an exegesis that is so outlandish that I just have to pause and share this with you. One school of creationists sees in "Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow" a kind of divine forecast. In Job's day, they didn't have microscopes and stuff, so they didn't know that all snowflakes are built on a 6-ray crystalline template and that they're all different from each other. But all that time, these wonders were known only to God, who had created them. And after thousands of years of groping in the darkness of ignorance, the good Lord inspired some people in the Netherlands to start grinding lenses, and before you knew it, we could see those snowflakes and a whole lot more that we never even knew existed. Isn't this a beautiful day that the Lord has given us? But the other camp of creationists says, wait a minute, let's not take that out of context. The irony is almost more than I can bear. The whole sentiment reads thus: Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? What does all that mean? It has nothing to do with pretty little 6-pointed snowflakes, does it? According to that camp of creationists, it's actually a prophecy relevant to World War II and the endeavor of the National Socialist military to secure heavy water from Norway for the development of nuclear firepower, water rich in deuterium. According to those creationists, it's easier to produce heavy water if you start with glacial melt, which is, of course, packed snow. I have been unable to corroborate their claim, nor have I seen any of them try to support it. Perhaps that reading has fallen out of favor. I wouldn't know. By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, or on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? If there wasn't a man there to do it, who did it? That's the question here. One of conscious agency. Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? Isn't this a beautiful day that the Lord has given us? The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. God, literally. Time for a little astrology lesson. Not astronomy, astrology. You still no doubt remember the scientifically accurate story of creation in Genesis 1, right? There, the author of the universe and ground of all being indicated that he had placed the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to rule over the day and night and to be for signs and seasons. It's no wonder that so many biblical zealots also lay great store by astrology and never neglect to read their daily horoscope, even while harboring secret fears that it all might be a lie of the devil. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? No. Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? No. Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Well, I know a little bit about Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Would that count? Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? You suppose God's talking about praying for rain, or rain dances, or screaming at the sky? Canst thou send lightnings, that they may go and say unto thee, Here we are? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds in wisdom, or who can stay the bottles of heaven when the dust groweth into hardness and the clods cleave fast together? Wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? They couldn't do it for themselves. God has to do it all for them. That's the message here. Who provideth the raven his food? When his young ones cry unto God, they wander for lack of meat. This is strong stuff, all right. The nourishing meat of the Word of God. Time for a lesson in animal husbandry, or some such thing. Knowest thou the time when the wild goats of the rock bring forth? Or canst thou mark when the hinds do calve? Canst thou number the months that they fulfill, or knowest thou the time when they bring forth? Well, we do now, thanks to, science. God doesn't seem to have been all that eager to divulge his secrets. I wonder why. They bow themselves, they bring forth their young ones, they cast out their sorrows. That's an interesting way to describe labor and birth. Their young ones are in good liking. They grow up with corn. They go forth and return not unto them. Who hath sent out the wild ass free? Or who hath loosed the bands of the wild ass? Whose house I have made the wilderness, and the barren land his dwellings. He scorneth the multitude of the city, neither regardeth he the crying of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searcheth after every green thing. So much for the wild ass. Let's see what the Word of God has to say about unicorns. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow, or will he harrow the valleys after thee? Wilt thou trust him because his strength is great? Or wilt thou leave thy labor to him? Wilt thou believe him that he will bring home thy seed and gather it into thy barn? I don't know. I'm not sure about any of those things. How about you? Gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacocks, or wings and feathers unto the ostrich, which leaveth her eggs in the earth, and warmeth them in the dust, and forgetteth that the foot may crush them, or that the wild beast may break them? She is hardened against her young ones, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without fear, because God hath deprived her of wisdom, neither hath he imparted to her understanding. I wouldn't want us to lose sight of the fact that, according to this divinely inspired narrative, it's God himself who is delivering this stream of consciousness diatribe worthy of Marjorie Taylor Greene. What time she lifteth up herself on high, she scorneth the horse and his rider. That was still the ostrich. Hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage, neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, Ha ha! And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. Doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom, and stretch her wings toward the south? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command, and make her nest on high? She dwelleth and abideth on the rock, upon the crag of the rock, and the strong place. From thence she seeketh the prey, and her eyes behold afar off. Her young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is she. God, what an insufferable braggart, and as ignorant as he is arrogant. Bear with me, just 6 more short verses to go on this beautiful day that the Lord has given us. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Poor Job. I have to wonder if, as he delivered those groveling lines, he was thinking something like, will this motor mouth never shut the hell up? Having to listen to this shit is even worse than these itching pustular boils. I'll bet Job was hoping that God would be satisfied with that show of humility and just go away back to heaven or wherever the hell he came from. But no, he's just now warming to his topic, and I'm going to save the rest until next week, when the creator of a trillion galaxies is going to show off his pet dinosaurs and brag about them. Bring your saddle. It's going to be a beautiful day that the Lord our God has given us.